All right, I'll just do the insights for that. So this massive data of database that I've collected. Okay, well, I've missed the science pass out, but basically the conclusions from analysing the distribution of the ranges of the species and their phylogeny and a space-time model of the amount of volcanism identified that diversification was driven primarily by volcanism and a paleo lake system. But just because we're talking about data here, the data management is really rather unwieldy at the moment for this database. The data is spread upon multiple ArcGIS databases and shape files. It's organically grown through 10 years of me fiddling about, trying to do different things, creating different subsets of data or whatever. So it is in direly need of a spring clean. I have been totally negligent in recording associated metadata with all these data layers, which makes it difficult for me to pass it on to somebody else, a student who might be interested to do the to enter the metadata and organise it. If I'd had good metadata, they probably could have organised it much better. I could have got an assistant to help me organise it. So that's a lesson. The metadata is in my head. I know where it's come from, but if I fall over, nobody else is probably going to know where it's come from. So that's not good. I've built geophylogenies. Okay, we've got to just quickly show you what a geophylogeny is, because that's a geophylogeny. This is what I spent my, I had 3 years in the States. I wrote software that basically takes these evolutionary trees and creates 3D space-time networks from them. Doesn't really matter how I do it, but they kind of look like this. And this is in arcsine, and basically I'm using the Z dimension. If you remember the time lecture, using the Z dimension in arcsine to represent, or in ArcGIS to represent time. So this is going back in time through here. It's a very complicated space-time tree network I built. Okay, but I'm gonna leave that bit because there's not time. I can maybe tell you, if we've got time next year, I can maybe tell you about something about that. Whoops, come on, where you go? Oh, wrong way. So I build these space-time networks. Data management. So I build these space-time networks, which I call geophylogenies. That's the word I'm hoping that one day will enter the Oxford English Dictionary with my name as having invented the word. But these geophylogenies are basically these evolutionary trees as a shape file, as a spatial data file made up of branches, lines, and nodes where the branches join. And these are hard-coded with the geometry Z values as representing time, so I can visualize them in 3 dimensions, which is great for visualization, but it makes it really difficult to edit these trees once they've been built. And I have to create, every time I want to change one, I have to sort of rebuild them. So that it's an unwieldy data model that's not easy to manage and edit. Well, you have to go in and you have to, I don't know whether you've met Z geometry, Z values have you done any Z values in ArcGIS? Basically the Z value is embedded within the geometry like the X and Y. So rather than having a field that you can simply just edit and change the value, you have to open an edit session. You have to then go in and then change the Z value in the edit session, which is more complicated than just changing location in edit value. But not only do you have to change the position, say if I wanted to change the Z position of one of the nodes where 2 of my branches join, I have to not only change the value of the node, I have to change the value of each of the branches that connect to that node as well. So I need topological editing in 3 dimensions, which modern ArcGIS may support, but it's certainly not been easy to do in the past. There's an awful lot of data. It's difficult to visualize space-time relationships. And I need a data model to develop a data model that supports this sort of partial information about drainage, connectivity, and hydrological histories, and is linked to the supporting data that I've used to reconstruct those hydrological histories. So it's a work in progress. Now the UK historical, GB historical database has a data model that it uses for tracking the changes in administrative areas in the UK. And I'd love to get a postdoc or something, or a graduate student to take that data model of changing administrative areas in the UK and apply it to changing basin connectivity in Mexico. Visualization, interaction. Okay, right, entangled bank. So this is probably more applicable to what we've done this year. So we start with another quote from Darwin. My life seems to be dominated by Darwin quotes. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants, many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other, in so complex a manner, have all been produced by the laws acting around us. This, along with the Tree of Life, are probably the two most famous quotes from The Origin of Species, two most famous metaphors. So, these are slides I've nicked off my ex-boss at Imperial College. So, there's some of these. So, the situation is, there's a growing need to ask ecological and evolutionary questions that draw on information from a wide set of data sets. What are the drivers of extinction? The drivers, in my case of the Mexican fish, what are the drivers of the distribution and the physiology and the ecology of the organisms of the Gudaidae spread across central Mexico? Then if we understand how things have worked in the past, then we can make predictions of the consequences of climate change and change in land use patterns and things in the future. I was just reading the other day in the Bath a Nature paper written by about 30 or 40 authors, some of which were people I was involved with this project, where they have in fact done this, and they're predicting land use change pattern, how land use change patterns over the next 50 years are going to affect patterns of global biodiversity. And they're only able to do this because of the large amounts of information that are increasingly available. And these questions, they can now address these kinds of questions because of advances in computer power. We can simply do the number crunching now. There are new statistical methods, particularly Bayesian. Have you ever heard about Bayesian statistics? Worth having a look up. It's an alternative way, a quite alternative approach to statistics compared with your normal statistics, and it's being used increasingly in these large complex data modeling situations. And we've got more and more suitable data available. So at Imperial College, they had a number of data sets that have been collected by people working at Imperial College. The Global Population Dynamics Database, a database of abundance time series for organisms all across the planet, all different types of organisms. Species range maps are increasingly available for a lot of common species. So we had species range maps for all mammals, for most reptiles, amphibians. Now we have birds. If you go to the ICUN, International Conservation website in Cambridge, you can download maps of hundreds and not thousands of species distributions now. We've got these traits, things like body size, body weight, period of gestation for how many offspring, things like that, how fast organisms can run, how high plants are. So we've got these trait databases, we've got these genetic databases, huge genetic databases now. It's the millions and millions of records of millions and millions of database base pairs for each record. We've got things like long-term individual-based time series. So this is where somebody has actually tracked the sort of the parentage and the history of parents and offspring of things like blue tits in a woodland. So they've mapped where every single blue tit is, We know who parented who, we know the weights of the offspring and all this kind of stuff. And also these phylogenies, these evolutionary trees and taxonomies that we've seen. So an evolutionary tree like the Gideid fish. So whenever we undertake some kind of large integrative science-based project that brings these large data sets together, we've got two key challenges. One is finding the data in the literature in the first place, and then compiling those data, bringing them together into a suitable form that we can actually do some kind of analysis upon them. So finding stuff and then actually putting it into an environment where you've got these different types of data and you can do things with them. So this is, I hasten to add, the grand aims of this project. We'll soon learn that grand aims possibly don't result in grand results. But, so, identifying suitable data from the literature, blah, 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 cross-study data is compiling appropriate form. So more and more data is being archived with the papers. So when you submit a paper to a journal, increasingly you need to submit the data to a data archive so it's available to other people to do further analysis, to check what you've done and to do other comparative analyses. So, I guess we're now 7 years ago. The idea was to create a tool where you can search for data on species, part of a taxonomy or a phylogeny, so remember even those trees, part of a tree, an area of space, a span of time, a range of traits. So that's what the kind of overall vision was, and that this tool should return data in a form that is suitable and easy to use in analyses. And it should be straightforward for users to upload data to this system. And this was basically the vision that I was employed to kind of help out on. Who would use such a tool? Well, various conservation biologists, managers, academics, decision makers. That was what they listed down. So I was employed for 18 months to help on this project. So you think when you start a project like that, we'd have a development methodology. We'd start thinking, okay, we've got this overall vision, let's start homing down on what we actually can do and how we're going to deliver that. Well, there was a lot of repeating of the grandiose statements about what wanted to be done. I haven't mentioned, well, I think the first slide showed, this was a joint project between Imperial College and Microsoft Research based in Cambridge. Microsoft Research is the kind of research arm of Microsoft Corporation. Now, I've had a little bit of contact previously with Google people and found them very good. I expected to have, really looking forward to working with some people at Microsoft, seeing how we got on, seeing what we could do. So there was a lot of hand waving and yes, isn't this going to be wonderful and what have you. And basically, Microsoft agreed. They were leading the development side of it. We were leading the biological side of it. Okay, so we were in charge of data. They were in charge of computer systems, basically. So Microsoft went away to build a preliminary system. But in my opinion, there was no clear plan what they were actually meant to be building. But they had the data. We'd waved our arms around. Good idea. So I wait for Microsoft to do something. In the meanwhile, I'm spending my time cleaning up these data sets held at Imperial College and doing other work while I wait for Microsoft to do something. And I wait some more. And I start to get a bit frustrated. After all, I'm sitting here, I don't know really what I'm doing. I'm cleaning these data sets up, but I've sort of done that. And I'm waiting for this tool to test so that we can really start to move forward with the project. We have a few more from my opinion, completely pointless meetings where people wave their hands about, reiterate what they've said previously, despite my efforts to say, look, we really need to identify particular action plans and what we can do and what this tool needs to do and what we hope this tool can do. We need to prioritize it. We need to decide how we're going to, what software we're going to build it with, all that kind of stuff. Incidentally, this was at the beginning, I suppose, of the explosion of cloud computing. Microsoft wanted to use their Azure cloud-based database for this system. It had no spatial functionality at that point. So the developer spent a lot of his time writing spatial query functions that existed in many other database systems, PostGIS, for example, which I was banging on the table and saying, look, PostGIS does this, PostGIS does this. But they wanted to use Azure, probably because they've got some direction from high up in Microsoft to demonstrate its utility. Anyway, so he spends a lot of time, gets wasted developing stuff that doesn't need to be developed. I wait some more. Eventually, I just give up waiting and start to build something myself because I'm so fed up with waiting for Microsoft to create something. But eventually, Microsoft do turn up with a prototype. But in my opinion, it's not of any great use. And I actually don't have any pictures of this prototype that they built, which is a bit annoying, but I didn't find any. I'm sure I've got something somewhere. So the reality was that we were trying to build a tool that sort of helped with this kind of activity. Somebody publishes some results, some data. Somebody publishes a paper with some data. Somebody else then wants to discover that data, find that data. It's somewhere in the publication system. You have to get it. Then you have to put it into some system where you can integrate the various different data types that you've collected in one place together. Then you can explore that data, undertake some kind of analysis, which may result in a new publication which pumps back into the system. So the reality of this project turned out to be, this partnership between Imperial College and Microsoft, was that Microsoft built a sort of tool that sort of did some of this stuff, but did none of this. And the tool that I built was to do with this integration and exploration and dissemination of data. I hasten to add that the Microsoft tool has died and never been seen again. Mine still exists on the web, but it probably doesn't get a huge amount of use, but I still think it's quite a novel system. So this is a sort of lesson in design methodology and having clear aims. This was a total muck-up, in my opinion. Other people may have other matters, but basically the communication between Imperial and Microsoft was rather poor. We didn't push Microsoft. There was no clear plan. They produced something which ultimately wasn't of any use whatsoever to anybody. And it's only by me actually gripping the bull by the horns and doing something we actually ended up with any product from this project at all. So I built what's called the EBDB, the Entangled Bank Integrated Database, or the Entangled Bank Database. So this is a PostgreSQL database that stores the population dynamics database, mammal range maps, what's called the Pantheria mammal trait database, which is a database of mammal body sizes and things like that, a phylogeny evolutionary tree of mammals, and a taxonomy of mammals. I built a web interface on top of that, which allows us to query within and across these data sets, return data in a variety of formats. And I used existing data schema wherever possible. So this is an example of a pseudocode. Pseudocode is just code that's sort of halfway between natural language and code. So this is the kind of thing that we wanted the system to do, to return a set of abundance time series as a CSV file format, the traits table as a CSV format, the species ranges perhaps in KML, KML being the markup language for Google Earth. Perhaps we want to do that for all rodents. rodents. How do we know which species are rodents? Well, we've got our evolutionary tree or our taxonomy, and we can search for rodents, the node in the tree that's rodents, and get all the species that are types of rodent. We perhaps want to put only interested in relatively large rodents, so rodents with a body size greater than 35 grams. Perhaps we're only interested in ones that overlap some kind of user polygon. Perhaps a user draws a polygon around South America, so they're only interested in South American rodents with a body mass greater than 35 grams. And we're only interested in time series between 1900 and 2000. So that's the kind of query that we want this system to undertake. So here's the architecture. So the Entangled Bank Integrated Database is a Postgres database. So standard Postgres, we can store our tabular data in Postgres. We've got the PostGIS extension for storing spatial tables. I used a number of other schema were brought in. So we have the original schema basically that maps onto the Global Population Dynamics database. So we have a schema, the GPDD schema for the time series data, abundance time series. I brought in, so from the networks and the trees that are stored in the database are stored in a schema called PhyloDB. This one, little one with the tree there. PhyloDB is an extension to a schema called BioSQL, which is a relational database schema used by geneticists to store DNA and protein data. So basically, I've taken these existing schema, added in my own schema called the Entangled Bank Data Model, which I'll explain in a minute, that ties all these data, these other schema, data stored in these other schema together. We can access the database, not surprising, through various clients, pgadmin3, Quantum GIS, just like you've been doing. And then I built a web database interface using open layers, the GDAL open source translation software. At one point it had some BioPerl script in it, but that's been replaced by when I migrated some of the functionality away from scripting into actual SQL queries written in PHP and JavaScript. So here's the PhyloDB schema. It doesn't really matter about the details of it. It's a schema, as I say, for storing trees in a relational database. So we've got node tables, edge tables. We can store attributes in these qualifier tables. Those are where we store attributes of the tree nodes and the tree branches. Okay, so that's PhyloDB. This was actually created by a ex-colleague of mine, Hilmar Lapp, in North Carolina. Now, PhyloDB came as a database schema, but it didn't come with any functions for doing much with it, SQL functions. So I spent quite a lot of time writing Postgres functions that would query the data in the tree database structure and return me my data. So this is an answer of a Postgres function that returns, in this case, a subtree on the basis of the name of a node in a tree. Doesn't really matter, but that's it. BioSQL was the largest schema that the biologists use for storing proteins and DNA sequences that PhyloDB is an extension of. I only used a couple of the tables in here. They have a table called term, which is that can be used to store enumerated lists. So that was where I stored all my control vocabularies and things like that. The GPDD schema, forget the geophylogeny schema there on the left-hand side. So the GPDD schema, this is rather a poor ER diagram, not the best, but we've got a number, it's made up of a number of tables, one containing the sort of name of the time series, another one containing the individual records for each species in the time series. We've got other ones that store information on what taxa it is and the location of the time series, and those time series are located both as points and as bounding boxes, depending on whether the time series come from a large area or a small area. So we've got two types of geometry associated with the GPDD in several tables. It's a relational structure in its own right. So the EBDB table, or the EBDB schema, provides, is what one of the things that I kind of created, and that acts like the, like you register tables in PostGIS in the PG catalog. Yeah, so you register a spatial table and its columns and its geometries. This does the same thing, does the same similar action, but it does it for more things. So it stores the location of where the biological names are in the system, the who's. Who is this data about? What species is this data about? It stores things about domain metadata, so what things are about. It stores the location of geometry columns and whether it's a spatially, where space is in the system, so where things are. And it also stores information about whether time fields exist in the system, because different data sets have these sorts of information in different places. And I also hope to implement at some point, or at some point in the future, to store actually relationships between data sets as well, but I haven't got as far as that. So what is a data set in this system? A data set is something like, it's a group, it's one of these data sets. So the Pantheria would be a data set, the global population database is a data set. And I store metadata, this system data, in a system metadata in a table called sources. Some other metadata is also stored as in a sort of soft typing system, but I won't go into that. And we've got the controlled vocabularies for this metadata is stored in the BioSQL tables. So basically this is acting like, basically registering these data sets in the entangled bank data sets so that when I undertake queries, I can know where, the queries know where this temporal data is, know where the spatial data is, and can go and find it. So I have several types of data defined in here. So data sets can be of a particular data type. So a bio table is a table with names. It's just a non-spatial table. So Pantheria, which is a table of traits, is an example of a bio table. We've got biogeographic tables, which are basically PostGIS tables, which has a name field with the species in it. Species name. We've got trees, biotrees, which are a tree, a PhyloDB tree, with names associated with the nodes of the tree. I've got networks, which is a network associated with named nodes. And I've got one called biocomplex, which is basically something that doesn't fit into that simple system. So the global population dynamics. So here they are, the Pantheria trait database is a single table with names, no space associated with it. The range maps are a single geographic table with names, one row for each species. The taxonomy is a tree with names at each node. The phylogeny is a tree with names at each node and a time at each node, an estimated divergence time in millions of years. And the global population dynamics database is one of these biocomplex systems, a relational database that contains geographic tables, names, and times. So the kind of operations that we want to do on these queries we want to take on these might want to do on these data sets are things like, which data sets are these sets of names in, are these species in? Get the spatial ranges of all cervidae. Cervidae are deer with a mean weaning body mass greater than 20 kilograms. Where do the urethra? Urethra are all the mammals except for the ones that lay eggs. Platypus, echidna, and echidna. Where do the ones not in the phylogeny live? Get the phylogeny with prunes of species in the deer or the monoptera. The monoptera are the ones that do lay eggs. So we can ask all sorts of queries. So we can write queries in, so once we've got all the data loaded into the Postgres database, we can start writing queries. So if I just want to get all the mammals with that are, I think the activity cycle equals 1 equals that they generally awake during the day. So they're not nocturnal, they're day animals. I can return all columns and 773 rows from Pantheria. So I'm just doing a simple SQL query on the Pantheria traits. Obviously, I can start doing joins to connect data in different data sets. So I want to get for this query, so I'm looking for the traits with an area. So I'm looking for animals with ranges that are greater than 10,000 kilometers squared that are awake during the day. So I can get that from the geographic data from the species ranges, which has an area field, but I can also, and joining that with the Pantheria traits through the names. So they're joined through the name field, the common name field. We can do spatial joins, familiar with those, so that's finding just from the geographic data set where the ranges intersect a bounding box. So you should be familiar with that. We create a bounding box and then we search for the ranges that are within those bounding box, and that's giving us the ranges of all species within the northern hemisphere. So remember I wrote all those tree queries. Well, I can write queries on trees like this. This is going to return all, which returns the names of nodes in the tree that are defined by the least common ADEX. Okay, so 2 genus, Camelus, camels, ADAX, what are ADAX? Can't remember what ADAX are. So this is returning all the names that are below those 2 names in a tree, using one of my queries, SQL queries. And we can start chaining these queries together to create more and more complex queries. So this one returns what? Returns, which would contain the names. This returns a table with a single column and 186 rows, which contains the names of the nodes in the taxonomy, defined by the least common ancestor of camels and ADAX, and that have ranges that intersect the northern hemisphere. So you can see we're building up more and more complex queries. Of course, that raises the query, how good is your SQL? Well, yours is bloody good now, I know that. Really good SQL, but most people aren't going to be able to write the SQL to address that database and do those kinds of queries. For example, we've got, at this point, there were 780 PostGIS functions. We're now up to 1,100 and something PostGIS functions to choose from. I wrote 40 PhyloDB functions. Most users think in biology. They think about names and places and times and relationships. They don't think about tables and spatial coordinate systems and trees. So we need to build, I build an interface on top of this so that non-expert SQL users can access and query this database. So I built this interface, and what this interface does is it returns all queries in the interface return a list of species names. That's what it does, or a list of names. They don't have to be species names, they can be genus names as well. This list is stored in a PHP session. PHP is a programming language that you'll be using that runs on a web server. So it's when you make a query of a web page, quite often it will be running a sort of PHP session underneath. And what the user does is build up a set of queries which are chained on top of this list of names. And then queries are stored in a session allowing the chain to be edited and queries rerun. So what does this look like? Okay, so there's the main interface. You can go and play with this online if you want. Still up, should still be running at entanglebank.sp.ic.ac.uk. So the first thing to do is you can select which data sets you want to actually query. Allows the user, if they're only interested in the global population dynamics database, then just select the global population dynamics database. Still quicken things up, to speed things up a bit. And it's relatively easy to add other sets of data into this system, apart from the global population dynamics. So that's your initial initial field, you just choose your data set, press next, or press next for all. This is the kind of main interface. So if we want to add a query, I can click on one of these. If I want to add a names query, which is just a query on the basis of names. A tree query, I press here. An attribute query, I want to press there. A geography query, I press there. A time query, I press there. And what we do is we add in a whole load of, we build up a chain of queries. So there's a tree query followed by a geography query. And it's joined through, remember, intersect and joining queries together. So this is so the answer is the intersection of the tree query and the geography query. Yep. The set of names that's presently in the data being returned by the query is the intersection of a tree query and a geography query. And here's the results, a summary of the results of the query, and these are the number of names returned and also the number of sources. So we've got our query, whatever that be, we've returned from five different sources. In total, we've returned 5 names, biological names, and they happen to be, all these names are actually in all of these sources, and we're returning 26 time series for the 5 species that match that query. Notice down the bottom, there's also a quick search at the top there that allows you just to type in a name and find out which data sets the name's in. I'll show you that in a second. And at the bottom, the user can add in a whole set of data returns. So they want to return the manual taxonomy, they can add a data return, and it will add a tree data return. And when you add it, you're prompted for what format do you want this to be returned in, because there are a whole variety of trends. So in this case, we're returning a tree, an attribute table, the geography, and the time series. And that's all getting wrapped up into our checkout, and we end up with a data package that zips all those together in the correct requested formats for return to the user. If we press the X there, that will delete all that query. So the quick search allows us to do things like this. I want to know pan-troglodytes, or what's pan-troglodytes? That's a chimp. So I want to know which data sets chimp, musculus, which is a mouse, and glis, which is the dormouse, are in. So I put those names in, comma separated lists, and I can see that we've got data for chimp in all 5 databases. If we hover over these, it tells us which database that refers to. But we've only got data for glis, the dormouse, for 4 of the 5 data sets that are available in the system. The geography query. The day I did this, we had an error. Okay. So this is just the simple interface that allows the user to draw polygons on the system, put points on the system, enter in bounding boxes, add bounding boxes. So this is your geographical search, and it's built on top of the open layers JavaScript mapping window. Okay, so that's the kind of, when you add a geographic query, this is the dialogue that you see. And then when you've set your query correctly, you press the run button and it runs the query, adds it, you return back to the main interface page and get your results. And there were one of those for each of the different types of query, but I'm not showing you those. So that's the system, it's up there and it's running. I never had any time to implement any use statistics, so I've absolutely no idea how many people are using it, how many people know about it, or anything else. It just sits there up in the Imperial server for those who happen to find it. So what have I learned through that? Okay, I think being clever is not always enough. So my bosses at Imperial College were members of the Royal Society. One of them is now in a very senior position at the Natural History Museum in London, another's a professor at Oxford. These are very, very clever people. The people at Microsoft have published some excellent research in other areas. And in these hand-wavy meetings, I seem to remember, of course, never trust your own memory or anyone else's But I seem to remember saying, statements along the lines of, oh, we're all clever people, it'll work. No, I'm afraid not. Just being clever is not enough. We needed a clear plan in which these general hand-wavy aims were translated into specific deliverables. And we never had that with Microsoft. When I started developing the database, I had a clear plan about what I wanted to do, and I'd been arguing for a good year that Microsoft should be doing what I ended up doing. And they didn't. So we lacked a clear plan with clear specific deliverables. There was a very poor understanding of how this initiative fitted into ongoing community efforts. The people who are running this system were biologists, not informaticians. They didn't know about, or were ignorant, and I don't hold this against them in any way whatsoever, because their expertise was in other areas. They didn't understand or appreciate what efforts were being done at sort of the European community level and things like this, and other global initiatives to integrate and create systems that allowed you to integrate these kinds of data sets together. So our system was totally separate in every way from every other initiative that's ongoing. I thought that was particularly... sometimes it's helpful to do your own thing. Sometimes it's a good thing to do your own thing and not to be constrained by what others are doing. But also, if you don't understand what others are doing, most other people are going to ignore you, and that's what happened. Other people had systems, large groups of communities of people building systems, and we were just some little group playing around on our own. So it didn't fit into what was happening more generally in the community. Clear, strong leadership is required. It was a case of too many chiefs and not enough Indians. You got 4 professors in charge of the project of the Imperial College and just one worker, me. They all have slightly different ideas. Nobody's particularly driving on a daily basis. And the person who was given eventually sort of daily control, again, was not an informatician and didn't push Microsoft. As far as I needed to do, I was concerned we needed meetings where we would sit with Microsoft and say, are you going to do this in this time period? And if you're not, then we effectively end this partnership. Partnerships do not always go smoothly. I've heard of people having very good partnerships with Microsoft Research. Don't want to trash them in any way, but the person we were working with was living in California. It seemed to be a part-time project. His mind was elsewhere. We used to turn up at a meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning, having been on a red-eye flight, and you could tell he was not very communicative. He was the prize hand waver. Too much bullshit, not enough action. Human resources must be in place. Well, for a long time, we didn't have a Microsoft programmer. The staff, every time we went to a meeting with Microsoft, we'd be meeting different people who'd been brought in as much to sit round the table, you got the feeling, rather than actually do any work. So there was a huge problem at their end from a human resources perspective. Your personal actions determine your future. I got bored and fed up and just got on with something. So sometimes you've got to grab the bull by the horns and do something. Otherwise, nothing will get done. But of course, one has to be in an environment where this is acceptable behaviour. I wish I'd known a lot more about web programming before I'd started. That was the first web program I had ever written in my life. It's mostly server-side. We're going to learn all about this next year. But it's a pretty basic interface by modern standards. It does what it needed to do, and I think that's really good. But if I'd rebuilt it at the end of when I'd finished building it, I would have, changed the architecture, changed how I would have built it from the beginning. But as a first stab, I think it's not bad. And just a sort of practical thing there. So for a while, I think I mentioned on that slide was using a Perl functions. Perl is a programming language, an old programming language, not one that I particularly like, but it's used a lot in biological systems because it's very good at text processing, and if you're processing large amounts of DNA sequences, a language that's good at text processing is a good language to use. So at one point I was exporting the trees from the database using a Perl program. And that would take, it would take minutes sometimes to export a big tree. When I eventually got the time to implement the export as an SQL function in the database, I got a performance of 20 times fold increase in performance. So migrating functionality from the programming environment into the database was extremely good when it comes to performance. And it made the system operable on the web, because previously if you're waiting for 2 minutes for a download on a web program, it's not good unless you implement a system that then emails you and tells you that the data's ready to download and all that kind of stuff. Have a good, that's really all I've got to say, and have a good Christmas. Any questions on my general waffles this morning? What, the Entangled Bank? It sat on the Imperial server for about 3-4 years now. I don't know whether it's still got the error with the Google Maps interface. Nobody's ever emailed me to tell me that it's got a problem.
Is it like anybody put data into it?
No. So at the moment, so basically it ended up being a prototype. I could upload more data into it very easily. Certainly the range maps, trait databases, trees, I can upload really quickly. And indeed I've got, my life is full of lists of things that I want to do, but since we produced it with the mammals, as I say, there's now evolutionary trees of all the birds, maps of all the birds, trait databases of all the birds. So I could get all the birds in there. I could get all the lizards and reptiles in the world there. So I could effectively have a database, the system containing almost all the information we know about all the vertebrates on the planet. But I've just not had the time, the inclination to do it. I've never got the time. When it comes to things like the population dynamics database, because I didn't have enough time to implement it's basically hard-coded into the interface there. So what that means is that I can't easily stick another relational database in. The system reads the schema in that relational database, automatically displays stuff on the interface in the correct way. But that's where I was hoping to get to, so that when you had a database schema, perhaps with spatial tables, perhaps with timetables, you could drag and drop it into your database. It would create the tables, upload the data, and then you could specify. And then the database itself, or the program around the database, would read the schema of the table and understand how to interpret that in terms of space and time and geography and things like that. So it's, in theory, yes, in practice, no. Right. Great. All right, well, I'll be there this afternoon for the last of the database.